Lymphatic system cells. When we think about lymphatic system cells, you want to think about B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and natural killer cells. B lymphocytes, they differentiate into plasma cells, which then produce antibodies. When we're looking at antibody, we can look at the heavy chain here. The heavy chain defines the type of isotope or antibody it is. We could also use the term immunoglobulin. It's interchangeable. An immunoglobulin G is the most abundant antibody in the human body. So it's always good to know the most, the least, the only. And antibodies can neutralize microorganisms by themselves, but they can also do it with complement and they can do it with phagocytes. Now let's go to helper T cells. And I chose this image because it kind of looks like a hand, right? Even though it's representing microscopic cells. But helper T cells will release cytokines, and cytokines are pretty amazing chemicals. They'll attract other cells to the area during times of infection, inflammation, and trauma. Now, helper T cells can also stimulate the production of B lymphocytes and thus plasma cells and antibodies. And they can also stimulate the activity of cytotoxic T cells and macrophages as well. Cytotoxic T cells, they're pretty impressive. They inject a preformed protein into cells, which induces apoptosis. That's cell death. It's pretty awesome. And then you could go to the next type of cell, natural killer cells. And natural killer cells do kill viruses and cancer cells, so much to the extent that they are getting looked at for treatments of cancer. So let's take a look at the notes. So you have B lymphocytes differentiating into plasma cells, differentiating antibodies. The heavy chain is to define the type of antibody. And again, immunoglobulin G is the most abundant antibody. Antibodies can neutralize microorganisms by themselves. They can do it with complement and phagocytes. Helper T cells. They release these chemicals called cytokines, which attract the immune cells to the area during times of inflammation, infection, and trauma. They can also stimulate the production of B lymphocytes and thus antibodies, plasma cells and antibodies, and stimulate the activity of cytotoxic T cells and also macrophages. Now, cytotoxic T cells, they inject preformed proteins, meaning the protein was already formed because they can recognize antigens. And antigens are, and so can helper T cells and B lymphocytes. Antigens are foreign substances or toxins within the body. And they recognize those, inject these preformed proteins, and then they induce, and those proteins induce apoptosis, which is cell death. And then we have natural killer cells, which will attack viruses and cancers, and so much to the extent they are getting looked at for treatment of cancer. Can you do it without the notes? Let's see if you can do it. The lymphatic cells, B lymphocytes, differentiate into plasma cells, produce antibodies defined by the heavy chain, immunoglobulin G, the most abundant antibody in the human body. They neutralize cells themselves. They can also do it with complement and with phagocytes. Helper T cells release cytokines, attracting other cells, immune cells, to areas of infection, inflammation, and trauma. And they can also stimulate the production of B lymphocytes, thus plasma cells and antibodies. They can also stimulate the activity of cytotoxic T cells and stimulate the activity of macrophages. Remember, macrophages engulf what shouldn't be there. Cytotoxic T cells, injecting preformed proteins into infected cells, inducing cell apoptosis, cell death. Natural killer cells. They will attack viruses and cancer cells, so much to the extent that they are getting looked at for the treatment of cancers. Thank you for joining me today.